Okay, I think that we are live. I hope that you can really hear me well. We are just waiting few minutes in order to let all the audience connect. Um, so just wait a bit. Okay, and here we are. Okay. Okay, I think that the slides are fine, the sound is good, so we can definitely start. So hopefully many other people will join in the meantime, because I see already many people connected. So maybe we can start, and in the meantime, we can also welcome the other people joining us. So first of all, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much to be here today with us. This event titled The Importance of Transaction Risk Analysis to Optimize the Conversion Rate will be an interesting, hopefully, discussion between three key players in the market: Axerve, Mastercard, and Riskified. Before starting, I would like to just give you two important organizational points, which are the event. We are recording the event, so in case, no worry if you are losing something, we will share through our channels after the event. Q&A, if you have questions, do not hesitate, please, and write all the questions in the specific section Q&A. Also, during the webinar, it's fine, and we will manage and take care about question at the end of the event. So now let's start with the agenda. Sorry, okay. With the agenda. So the first part will be an overview of the authentications in 2021 by Mastercard, to have a bit understanding where we are now with the 3DS2 implementation, how the market is going, and which are the challenges that the market is facing. Mastercard, of course, you know, Mastercard is really helping this huge enrollment to work directly, working directly with the PSPs, merchants, and other key players in the payment chain. Then we'll have Axerve with an analysis on 3DS2 performances, and it's an interesting point of view from a PSP level. Axerve, if you don't know who is Axerve, maybe is an Italian company, part of a private bank group founded in 1886. Axerve manage payments worldwide for many clients with international projects and with the several milestones achieved in the last 20 years. Just to tell you something quite cool about Axerve, about us, we managed the first Italian transaction in e-commerce, so managing the payments. And then the last part, Axerve advice to optimize conversion rates. Last part will be about solutions, so how we can optimize the conversion rate. And then I will let our product experts to manage the discussion and explain what we did. And I'm saying what we did because we did together with a huge and really important partner on fraud prevention for us, which is Riskified. And I'm sure you will well known Riskified. And just to tell you something very, very short, and then I will let Doron to present a bit. They got the unicorn status at the end of 2019. And then, of course, the last part, as I was saying, Q&A. So just really short presentation about the panelists. Of course, will be me as sales and business development in Axerve, and then Antonio from Mastercard as a Cyber and Intelligence Solutions Manager, then Doron as a Senior Product Marketing Manager for Riskified, and then Michele as a Product Manager for Axerve. Now we can definitely start. So I will let Antonio start with the overview of authentication in 2021 by Mastercard.
Hello, good morning. Good morning to everybody. I hope you can hear me well. Yes, thanks for inviting me in making this presentation. I will focus in giving you some highlights about how the market is evolving, in particular in focusing on 3DS flow and what is the Mastercard view in Europe in general, and also in some specific market here in Europe. So let's start saying that focusing on 3DS flow, in particular, I'm seeing the 2.2 or 2.1 protocol. What Mastercard is seeing is that starting from the beginning of this year, the number of transactions, the average daily transaction are increasing. And as you can see from this slide, the increase has been of almost 50% from January this year. At this moment in time, if we are going to see what is happening in the authorization flow, we can see that almost 20% of the total transaction that has been processed in Europe are processed using the 3DS protocol, either 1.0 or the new protocol. This is a big achievement because basically this number is increasing daily on daily basis. What is also seeing is that this is nothing that is not expected because with the PSD2, this is exactly what we were waiting for. So the number of transactions that require strong customer authentication will increase, even if, as you can see, the number of transactions that are not requiring those strong customer authentication is still relevant in Europe, is around 80%. And this is something that also is expected because what is happening is that in Europe, especially those big merchants, e-commerce merchants, are strongly leveraging acquirer or merchant exemption. So basically what we are seeing is that now there are two ways that things are moving. Or people, merchant requiring strong customer authentication and going through the 3DS flow, or basically merchants that are leveraging their acquirer or merchant exemption to process their e-commerce transaction. This is an overview of Europe, but let's focus on the Italian market. Numbers are basically more or less the same. The only big difference that I want to point out is that in April, in particular, starting the 12th of April, the increase in terms of 3DS transaction has been really huge in Italy. 48% of increase versus the previous months is a very big number. And this is just because of, in Italy, basically starting from April 12, we are in PSD2 environment in full. Basically, we are issuing and acquiring level are applying all the requirements of the PSD2. For the rest, what we can say, the numbers also in the authorization flow more or less are similar to what we have seen at European level. So increase of 3DS flow, the 2.0 protocol that is increasing, and also in Italy is around or more than 50% of total 3DS2 transaction, and the rest of transactions that are still going through the authorization flow, but basically leveraging the exemption. Okay. Having said this from an overview, obviously the question that I expect from my merchant side is, yes, but if we are seeing the 3DS flow, how is the performance? And we can see it on this slide. in which basically we have reported how is performing in terms of successful authentication the 3DS flow around Europe and in those specific market. Just to give you a mention, these are refer 2.2 protocol data. Okay, so on average, what we are seeing is the positive is that the authentication rate is improving from January to April, and on average in Europe we are at 74% of authentication rate. So means that out of 100 transactions that hit the 3DS flow, 75 of those transactions has ended as a has done a successful authentication. There are some markets that are really good. You look at UK, but also Czech Republic. Some other markets are not performing in such good way. And maybe they have some room of for improving this situation. And I'm particularly referring to Italy, as you can see, 60%, France, 77%. Spain is a little bit better positioned versus the other market. What is the reason behind this difference of performance in those markets? In those markets, basically, we can say that here is the main reason cause. Basically, the real driver behind this difference in the authentication rate is linked with the usage of the frictionless flow. What I mean with the frictionless, the possibility that issuer have from the PSD2 to leverage exemption, issuer exemption, when a 3DS transaction is coming. An exemption means that issuer can avoid to make a challenge to the cardholder, but they can authenticate this transaction without this challenge. So friction, without any kind of friction. And so as you can see, frictionless, the usage of the frictionless is the real driver for the authentication rate. Those markets that are leveraging a lot of this possibility, issuer exemption, are having a better performance in the authentication. Those that are not leveraging this opportunity are behind in the authentication. And here you can see that UK, as we have seen before, are a stronger supporter of this frictionless flow, let's say, this opportunity, but also Spain is well positioned, while France and Italy these opportunities leveraged only by few issuers. And this is a very important message for you all merchants, because basically, so you need to keep in mind that whenever you are going to trigger a 3DS transaction in those countries, you have a real, very likely possibility that this transaction will result in a challenge for the cardholder. And this is very important for you because basically, if this is going to happen, in some cases, in some market, not always a challenge request will result in an authentication. And here we reported some numbers that give you an idea why and how much transaction, when a challenge is done, are going to be lost for the different market. So basically, what is going to happen in those markets is that there are still some kind of problem that are making a 3DS transaction, a 3DS challenge not going in the proper way. The situation and the cause of this may change country by country, but basically in Italy, what we are seeing is that the main reason code are referred to the abandonment. So meaning that the cardholder have not yet very well understood how the new strong customer solution authentication method work. In some cases, they are not enrolled, okay? So basically, issuers are still doing the enrollment of their cardholder in these new methods for the authentication. And there are still some technical problem around this new solution and also the ACS, let's say, operation. Even if those technical problems that you have seen here in this number are also affected by some merchants that are not replying in a proper way when a challenge is required. So here the message for you is for sure, if you have in this situation with this number, if you have the opportunity to leverage acquirer exemption is the better way to manage those transactions. And as you have seen in the numbers, a lot of merchants are already doing this. Otherwise, you need to go through the 3DS flow, but what you can expect a very different situation, market by market, but also in the same market, issue by issuer, because there are some issuers that are leveraging the issuer exemption, others that are not doing the same. And when this is going to happen, it's not unlikely that something may go wrong. And this is because basically we are in a process of improvement, issuing side, a process that is involving either the technical part, but also the user experience, cardholder user experience, a new methodology for authentication. This is a learning phase, will require some time. So this is more or less the situation that you need, that you can expect and you need to face off. So this is from my side an overview about the 3DS server and what we are seeing. If you want, we can move to the following part.
Yeah, thank you so much, Antonio. I'm just jumping to say that I see some questions that, as I was saying, we will manage at the end. So don't worry and don't hesitate to write questions. Thank you so much, Antonio, again for your quite interesting overview, global overview from a scheme perspective, which is very, very interesting, and also your final insights on that. And then I will let Michele go deep on as Axerve, actually, from a PSP level, what we see on our clients and merchants.
Thank you, Alessio. Yes, as Alessio said, we as well as a PSP indeed are monitoring the data that is coming through our systems, and we performed some analysis on such data. What I would like to do is to share how our PSP is performing compared to the data that Mastercard observed on a global level. And specifically, I will make some considerations on how the issuers are performing if compared one to another. So the first slide I would like to show you is this one. So here, what we are showing you is the data we have noticed in the month of April. So it is not a very long period, it's 17 days. However, this is the most relevant time frame we decided to share with you. The reason for this is that, as many of you already know, in April, the ramp-up plans that a number of countries have decided to adopt have ended. What we have observed are on the left side of the slide, you can see what kind of answer we received when we attempted a 3DS transaction. So basically what you see here, and the main information you can take away is the percentage of transactions for which a challenge is required, so a proper SCA authentication, and the percentage of transactions for which a frictionless flow is applied. So this means that the buyer will not see any friction, he just clicks pay and the transaction moves forward with an authorization OK or KO result. On these numbers, what I can comment is that you can see that the challenge rate is around 76%, and the frictionless is at 60%. This data is on our overall traffic, so not only Italian transactions, and it has increased compared to the beginning of the year. So the frictionless chunk of transaction has increased from, let me say, below 10% to 60%, which is a good trend. What you can see on the right side of the slide is how the transactions that are required a challenge end up eventually. So basically, how many of these challenges are successful and how many of these fail for any reason. And here again, what we can see is that we have around 72% of successful challenges, which underlines a good trend, because at the beginning of the year, we had around 60% of successful challenges. The combination of these two kind of information, so how many challenges are requested versus how many frictionless transactions are done, and how many of the challenges result in a good flow, in a successful authentication flow, gives us what I called in this slide, the authentication conversion rates. So the authentication conversion rates, which is around 76%, gives us a figure that allows us to understand how many of the transactions that are required to undergo a 3DS2 flow can eventually proceed to an authorization flow. And this is the overall information on all the transactions we process. The other analysis I would like to add is something that Antonio already mentioned and in his speech, but he didn't show direct number about this. And it is a bin range analysis. What we can say about a bin range analysis is that roughly I can simplify the concept as saying that we look at the specific issuers and how each issuer is performing. So a bin range is basically a partition of cards that each issuer is providing to their customers, and they are associable. A bin range can be associable directly to one issuer. What we have observed is this kind of distribution. So if we look at the authentication conversion rates we see for each dot, where each dot you see in this figure represent one bin range, so one issuer, you can see that some dots have very, very good performances. So over 80 or even over 90% of authentication conversion rates, and other issuers are struggling a lot. So are maybe below 70 or even below 60% of conversion rates. What are the reasons for this? Well, the reasons are more than one. So along the line of what Antonio said, our analysis, which you can, by the way, read more about in the white paper that we will share after this webinar, our analysis has identified two main trends. The first trend is obviously what Antonio was saying as well. So if an issuer has a very, very important adoption of frictionless flows, that issuer will be, of course, more able to approve transactions in the 3DS flow because they are not applying a friction in the process. However, what is very interesting that we have noticed is also that a number of issuers apply challenges very often. So even maybe above 80% of the transactions are challenged, but these issuers are very, very good at performing the challenge. So their user experience they are providing to the cardholders is very solid, very stable, very clear. And so the user can actually complete the process without interrupting the transaction. So what are the key takeaways in our opinion on this? Well, the first one is, let me say, what can the merchant do? On one side, you can communicate with your buyer. So as we have seen that the main reasons for a failure in the challenge is usually on the issuer side. What a merchant can do is not very much, but you can communicate with your buyers, preparing them to face a challenge, because a lot of failed challenges are due to abandonments. So for example, they see the authentication screen, they don't understand what it is, they see they are asking banking data and they close the page. So you can avoid this by communicating them. You will be probably challenged, you will be asked to authenticate, so be prepared for that, and thus reduce the abandonment rates. The other thing you can do, as Antonio mentioned, is to take in your own hands the possibility to do a frictionless flow. And how you can do this is basically leveraging on acquirer exemptions, which is what I would like to discuss now. So we have seen an overview of data of what are the trends that we are seeing in the market. Now what we would like to focus on is what is the solution we have been developing until now to leverage this kind of exemptions. So we have seen that PSD2 basically has the goal to improve security both for the merchant and the buyer by authenticating the buyer. But the cost of this security at the moment is very high. So we see that around 25% of your volumes as a merchant risk to be lost. What can be done is to use exemptions. And the most powerful of the exemption tools is TRA. Why it is the most powerful tool? Because it has less limitations than our similar tools. It also provides a high security of the payment. So just to give you an overview from a normative perspective of TRA, TRA basically stands for Transaction Risk Analysis, and it is a real-time risk scoring of the transaction. It can go up to 500 euros, which is, let me say, a theoretical value because it is dependent on some acquirer indexes, such as the fraud rate of the acquirer. And the threshold that the most acquirers we are working with reach is 250 euros. So we are not aware of anyone who can go up to 500. What happens if the transaction is scored? The transaction, if it is not indeed fraudulent in its nature, it can be exempted from 3DS. So the transaction is submitted in the authorization phase with an exemption request. In case a transaction is exempted, the liability, which for sure you know is one of the main changes with PSD2, instead of shifting to the issuer, it stays on the merchant. This means if an exemption is requested on a transaction and it ends up being a fraud, the liability is on the merchant. What does this mean in practice? So the flow that we would have with Axerve solution, which we call the Axerve advice, and we have developed, as Alessio said, together with Riskified, is the following. So the first thing that would happen to the transaction is the application of a TRA to check if this transaction is, first of all, eligible or not to be exempted. And if it is, if the fraud parameters we can observe on this transaction indicate high risk or low risk. If the transaction is low risk, indeed, the goal is to step the authentication flow. So to avoid that friction that causes you that 25% of average loss of transactions and go directly to authorization. We have added a further step to this. So the further step is that with Axerve Guaranteed, after the authorization, the transaction receives a second scoring, which is more precise for the sole reason that it has more time to be performed. And that second check allows us to guarantee the transaction. So in case, for any reason, the first check, the TRA, has given you a false positive result and the transaction is fraudulent in reality, and you receive a fraud, in that case, Axerve can cover all the costs related to that fraud. So basically, the order is guaranteed against fraud. Before proceeding with a more detailed overview of how the flow works in our gateway, I would like to let Doron explain something more about how frauds work, what patterns they noticed, and indeed why Riskified is a very good and very solid solution to provide such services.
Thank you, Michela. So first of all, what you see in front of you are the three key challenges. If we'll go back here, the three key challenges from a merchant perspective around PSD2. So we talked a lot about friction, and thank you, Antonio and Michela, for showing the hard data. So the very much anticipated or feared from drop-off due to card abandonment, due to customer behavior, or the lack of configuration at the issuer side of the risk engines is something that we're starting seeing. But there are two other challenges which we need to take into consideration. The first on the right here is the bank authorization. Again, due to the inherent liability shift, which you mentioned, Michaela, the banks will probably take a very conservative approach, meaning they want, they're risk averse. If there is a risk of fraud in a specific transaction, they probably will decline it rather than just take it with the risk associated with it. So that is something that you, the merchants, needs to take into consideration, which brings us to the middle challenge, which you see here in front of you, the fraud element. And we know that fraudsters are sophisticated, and our insights team had gone into the dark web, where you can actually see chat rooms talking about how to bypass three-factor authentication, and also shifting to other fraud MOs, modus operandi, so fraud attacks, on using non-European cards, for example. Why? Because they're out of scope. That's the one-legged out of scope transactions. Anonymous prepaid cards. Why? Because again, out of scope, you cannot authenticate an anonymous card. So that is also something that any merchant should take into consideration in their volume and fraud prevention strategy. Call center. So we are seeing a shift or discussions about fraudsters thinking about attacking call centers, whether it's phishing or any other smishing attacks for a call center, and account takeover in the sense of loyalty or rewards for you, the merchants. And that is something also to take into consideration when thinking about the fallout or the side effect of PSD2 on your fraud management strategy. So if we move to the second, So as we mentioned, SCA is not fraud proof. Our teams had gone to the dark web, where you actually see fraudsters chatting between themselves how to bypass the two-factor authentication, which is SCA. And that's the conclusion, that you need a robust fraud prevention solution. If you can switch to the next slide, that will be perfect. Yeah. And our TRA, which is AI-driven and done frictionless, is qualified under the 6 robust requirements that are listed on the PSD2 regulation. That's Article 18.2C, which requires 6 robust elements. For example, the information on the device and abnormally on the behavior or risk patterns of the payer, and risky location and stuff like that. And our solution was developed specifically to meet the requirements of the TRA. Basically, we have been perfecting it for the last couple of years. So this is just another element how our already developed solution qualifies for the PSD2 specific requirements with the specific features that are listed here, whether it's IP and device linking and spoofing and proofing and proxy detection, etc. If we move to the next slide, our platform is built specifically also to address the pre-auth requirements, which are real-time and synchronous to the payment process. And as Michaela, as you mentioned, our accuracy is so robust, and we believe in our models that your solution powered by Riskified also provide a fraud chargeback guarantee on 100% on all approved orders. Okay, so it's the entire platform, not just the features that address the specific TRA. And as a recap, if you think about fraud management, you need to take care to cover any out of scope orders from a fraud prevention perspective, and also something that is important to understand, securing your MID or cleaning your MID, a MID merchant identifier, basically your risk profile at the issuer banks. So it's not a good strategy to send risky orders to 3DS. Why? Apparently it could be fraudulent, as we have seen. And by doing so, your risk profile, your MID, at the issuer side will be hurt, and you are jeopardizing your future bank authorization. So that is from me, and I'll hand over to Michaela to share with us the exact flow of our solution, our combined solution.
Thank you, Doron. Yes, so what I would like to discuss now with you is the flow, the specific flow of how a transaction goes through our system once the advice service is active and the TRA might be applied. So starting from the top left, what's the first thing that happens to a transaction is an exemption, what we call an exemption eligibility check. What this means is a transaction reaches our systems and a number of checks is made. Some of these checks are indeed the value of the transaction. So if it is over or below the threshold that the acquirer allows to be processed as an exemption. And well, indeed, if the service is active and if there are any specific restriction that might apply in that case. Indeed, if the transaction is not eligible, it will proceed with a regular 3DS flow. If it is eligible, it will proceed to Axerve advice. Axerve advice is something that happens in the background. So basically it is, let me say, invisible in a sense to the merchant because it performs a check on the transaction. So what happens here in the background is that we send a number of information that have been collected. So there are two main clusters of data. The first one is behavioral data, which is collected directly by Riskified, observing how the buyer is behaving during the order. So if they have specific fraud patterns, if they use copy-paste to insert the card number, if they are very quick to add all the most expensive items to the chart and so on. So these are the first set of data. The second set is, let me say, data such as the buyer name, the address, the card number, indeed, the email, and so on. Using this data, a fraud score is assigned to the transaction, and the result can be threefold. So let's start with the negative results, let me say. So the first negative result is fraud. There are cases where a Riskified system using older data are able to understand that the transaction has clear fraud patterns. And so we decided, after a long discussion about this, to stop the transactions here. And the reason why we decided to stop the transaction and not, for example, proceed to a regular 3DS flow is what Doron was mentioning. So that it is very important and beneficial also for the merchant to not proceed to authorization with high fraud orders. And also because, as Doron said, that there is a possibility for a fraudster, if he is particularly sophisticated, maybe to be able to bypass 3DS somehow. So to pass the 3DS authentication, even if it is a fraud. And it would damage both the acquirer and the merchant if a fraud happens in that case. The second outcome might be a 3DS suggestion. So basically the risk scoring system doesn't see a clear-cut fraud, but it doesn't even consider the transaction fully secure. In this case, what we do is to not suggest an exemption, but to try a regular 3DS flow, just to be sure that everything is okay. The third result is indeed the one that I think will be the most common one. And here, Doron, if you have any numbers maybe to share after this slide, we can discuss it, and I think it will be interesting, is a request exemption. So the transaction will be suggested to go to authorization by skipping 3DS. And here what happens is that we send the transaction to the authorization with a parameter that says to the issuer that this transaction has been analyzed and for us is secure. Again, here we can have two outcomes. The first outcome is that the transaction is accepted, and this will by far be the most common outcome. Or the other result that might happen in some cases is that the issuer declines the request. So the issuer responds with a soft decline, which means please authenticate this transaction. After you authenticated it, I can authorize the transaction for you. If the transaction is accepted, we proceed to authorization. If not, of course, we go back to the merchant. We respond with the specific error to perform a 3DS authentication, and the transaction will be managed with a regular 3DS flow. If the exemption, on the other hand, is accepted, what we do is we obtain, of course, an authorization result. And after the authorization, we perform a second security check, which is Axerve guaranteed. I think some of you are already familiar with this product as it has been around for a while. Basically, what happens here is that a second check is done by Riskified systems. And it is, let me say, somehow more accurate because there is more time to do it. You know, in the first step in the TRA, we need to be very quick because you have the buyer on session and he needs to receive a feedback. After the authorization, however, a check might take 4, 5, 10 seconds. So the time that is needed to provide the most accurate result possible. So the Axerve guarantee check has one goal: to confirm basically what in the first step has been said, and in the most cases it will confirm it, and to provide a clear-cut result, which can be approved or declined. On a declined response, which as I said will be a very, very small number of cases, the transaction will be interrupted because it is a fraudulent order. In case it will be approved, indeed, as we said earlier, Axerve will guarantee the potential risks for a fraud on that order. What you can see on the bottom of the slide basically is the liability. So as a merchant, what risks do you have in each of the outcomes? So as you see, when you go to the regular 3DS flow, the liability will stay on the issuer because the transaction has been authenticated by them. In case you have a decline, we interrupt the transaction to basically have a better mid reputation on one side and avoid useless frauds. And in the last case, so which is the majority of the transactions that will be processed these ways, you will have an Axerve guarantee, which means the liability would be on the merchant because you applied an exemptions. However, since we did a second check and we are confident of the quality of this check, we guarantee any fraud in these cases. So this is the flow, how it works overall. Doran, would you like to add anything or if you have any numbers about the percentages of transactions that will go to a TRA, so an effective exemption, for example?
So it's important to say that it's still early days, right? Exemptions or PSD2 enforcement just started now across the continent. So it's still early. We anticipate that there could be up to 25 and even more percentage of all total transactions that could be eligible for TRA. And therefore, this is the number that we're aiming for. I'll just say two things, Michaela, just you know, on what you just mentioned. I think that the SLA for the robust Axerve guaranteed solution is less than 10 seconds from what I know. It's around 3 seconds or something like that. You know, as I mentioned before, we are not a risk scoring solution, but rather a fraud prevention, and our models are so accurate that we stand behind them. So our incentives together are aligned to approve as much TRA, as much exemptions as possible, according to the merchant's incentive. So we are relying on that to minimize the fraud and maximize conversions to the higher extent.
Thank you. I'm also taking a look at the questions that arrived in the meantime. So one question was about how many transactions are expected to be managed as exemptions by our solution. And another one I would like to assess now before going to the next slide, since it is strictly correlated to this slide we are looking at now, is the following question. If I'm using exemptions like one leg ones, so I'm not using Axerve and Riskified solution, how can I be protected for those transactions? So with regards to this question, what I would like to say is that indeed, if the transaction is not under the PSD2 umbrella, let me say, or basically is not under the 3DS regulation, that transaction can be sent directly to the second check, so to Axerve guaranteed. What we are already doing now with some merchants who process a lot of transactions, for example, in America, is to switch off directly 3DS because it is a useless friction for them, and protect all the volumes using Axerve guaranteed. So basically, we don't do what you can see here as advice. The transaction does not go in the exemption eligibility check. It goes through a check that happens before that. And the check says, okay, is this transaction one leg? Yes. Okay, so I go directly to authorization. And after authorization, it goes directly to Axerve guaranteed. So basically, it is if the transaction directly goes to guaranteed without all the steps you can see on the left side of this slide. All right, so I think this is an overview of what the system is. The last thing I would like to add is how the technical integration would work. So just 2 words on this, which for any further detail, I invite any participants to further discuss directly with their commercial and sales contact. But in a nutshell, what happens here is the technical integration has 2 requirements. If you already use Riskified or our integration as Axerve guaranteed, you already know. If not, what you need to know is that there are 2 elements. The first one is you have to install what is called a storefront beacon, which is a JavaScript you have to install on your website, and it collects the data, the behavioral data I was mentioning earlier of how the buyer behaves on your website. The second element we need to collect is some order details. So these are some further information about the order. There are some mandatory data indeed, which are used to assess the risk level of the transaction. And these are like the merchant name, the email, the address, and so on. Okay, with this, I think we finished also the product part, and I would like to leave space to questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Michele and Doro. Really interesting for me, and I guess also for our attendees. So we are definitely on time, and we can. I see some questions, so actually we can go through them and see who can answer. So let me read the first one. Do all transactions have to go through 3DS, or can a business set a value under which the sale doesn't go through the 3DS? Example, under £20. I don't know, maybe if Antonio, I saw that you are unmute the microphone, so you want to answer that.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I can take it. So basically, as I mentioned, the PSD2 requirements are considering that either issuer, either acquirers can take a exemption. So skip the strong customer authentication. So to answer this question, you must have in mind that also you as a merchant or as an acquirer have the power to leverage exemption. Obviously, you need to respect the requirements that the regulation is considering in order to leverage this opportunity. But you have the power to leverage it. And having seen the numbers that I showed to you, this is for sure our suggestion. If you want to see your transaction really have the higher approval rate, at this moment in time, this is the best things to do. Leverage your acquirer or merchant exemption. If you are not put in this condition, there is just the other solution. You need to go through the 3DS flow, and here the scenario that you will face are 2. Basically, there are some issuers that maybe are in a situation or have decided to leverage their issuer exemption, and so the transaction will be authenticated frictionless without making any challenge to the cardholder. Otherwise, the solution is to challenge, to make the challenge. And as I said, we are on a learning curve. The situation is improving, but to be totally sincere and transparent, issuing side on the authentication situation have still rooms to improve.
Quite clear, absolutely, and thank you. And maybe I will take also the second one for you, Antonio. The second one is, how should UK transaction be managed now and after September?
This is a good question, and I several times answered this question. So for me, there is an important point that we need to consider from a regulation standpoint. So basically, the regulation, what is asking is that for each e-commerce transaction should be a strong customer authentication, unless an exemption is it can be applied, or unless the transaction is out of scope. Okay. This principle of a strong customer authentication apply to all those transactions that are within the European perimeter. So that those that are defined as a two-legs transaction. But this is very important. It applies also to one-leg transaction. The only difference is that in this case, for one-leg transaction, apply a best effort principle. So basically, the regulation, what is saying is that we are sure that in Europe, the 3DS flow should be is working, should be working properly. But in any case, we are sure that issuer and acquirer are able to leverage the 3DS flow. We are not sure what is happening outside of Europe. Okay, so we cannot be sure that an issuer in let's say in other country like US are able to leverage the 3DS flow, or are able to activate or send a merchant, are able to send a transaction to the 3DS flow. And so in this case, should be used the best effort principle. Why I am saying this? Because the UK, after the Brexit, is considered not part of the PSD2 perimeter. So we are talking of one-leg transaction. And this means that, to be totally transparent, if you are a merchant and you are able to send the 3DS, a transaction to the 3DS, you should, you can do it, okay? But if you don't want, you can send it directly in the authorization flow, and you can expect this transaction to be approved by the Italian issuer. Things are going to change when is coming September, because UK, what has stated clearly that after September, they will enforce the 3DS flow. And so after September, a merchant must be totally compliant with the PSD2 regulation. And so it's not valid anymore, the best effort principle. Everything that we are seeing now and we have seen around the two legs transaction will apply also for transaction coming from the UK market.
Absolutely, absolutely with you, Antonio. And I'm just reading some other questions in the meantime are coming. So maybe we can say a bit on you, and because one specific question was the last one, is something that, in my opinion, you already answered that a bit, but maybe you can go a bit deep. What is the best strategy from Mastercard point of view to increase the conversion rate done by merchants? And I'm reading also another one which could be connected. Are you putting the merchants in a situation to leverage the full spectrum of acquirer exemptions? Thank you. Maybe also this one can be also for Axerve and Riskified, but definitely the first one is for you.
As I said, that for me, basically, the strongest things that we can do as an ecosystem is to leverage the exemption. Okay, because leveraging exemption, we are reducing the frictionless in our system. So my suggestion is, if you are a merchant and you are in a condition to leverage this situation, I strongly suggest you to leverage this acquirer or merchant exemption. Obviously, if you are not in this condition, the best way is go through the 3DS flow and leverage what issuer can do, either in leveraging their own exemption or in managing in the best way possible the strong customer authentication with their cardholders.
Absolutely, and maybe I can link and asking Michele to answer something that is specific for Axerve, and maybe Doron, let's see if you want to add something from a Riskified point of view. But there's also a specific question dedicated for Riskified. I read it, and the questions are you putting the merchant in a situation to leverage the full spectrum of acquirer exemptions? And are you able to manage different strategy for different beans? So maybe we can collect the two questions in one answers.
Okay, so if Doron, it's okay for you, I would start with an overview on Axerve's approach. So, well, indeed, as Axerve being a payment provider, these topics are very much in our focus currently. So I would like to start with the first question, which is if you're putting the merchants in a situation to leverage the full spectrum of acquirer exemptions. With regards to this question, well, we are providing solutions. We are working using different indicators in order to assess the main pain points. So what we are doing in this moment is we cover the basic cases. So for example, indeed, Moto transactions can be used, recurring transaction can be used, and one-leg transactions can be used. And we are now launching this solution for TRA. What we are still having some thoughts about, which might seem very obvious on a merchant side, but it is not so obvious on a PSP side, is low-value exemptions. So basically, what is our stream of reasoning? It is, okay, we know for sure, and also Antonio, maybe you can give some more information on this, that the issuers are adopting frictionless flows. But when we speak about frictionless flows on the issuing side, we are really speaking about low-value exemptions. So if we took all the frictionless transactions, I think, I don't have a figure at the moment, but I think the vast majority is below 30 euros of value. So what we would like to do as a PSP is to provide tools for all those merchants who fall in the other category. So who have a lot of payments above 30 euros, but under 250, for which basically at the moment, if we look specifically at Italian issuers, they don't have any solution. I mean, there is really little hope to receive a frictionless flow on those transactions. So here we decided to prioritize a TRA solution, basically because it is more powerful. It allows to go to higher volumes. The second reason why on low value we didn't adopt, let me say, an official solution, because we have some works around that can be applied in some cases. The reason why we don't have an official and, let me say, very wide solution is that we feel there is a high risk on low value transactions, because the market, and therefore also the fraudsters, know that for low value transactions, there is a high propensity on the issuer sides at the moment to apply a frictionless flow without necessarily having very solid fraud checks behind. And if as a PSP, we start doing frictionless on low value transactions without any check, then of course we expose ourselves, the merchant, and also the acquirer to a high risk. Because if we take some businesses where the average ticket is below 30 euros, they can be very, very exposed to such fraud cases. So what we suggest is to maybe leverage the TRA solution, which does also a fraud check risk on the transaction, also on low value transactions, because basically we can understand if it is a high risk or low risk transaction, regardless of the amount, and send it through if it is secure, but stop it if it is a fraud. So I don't know, Doron, if you want to add anything about the fraud patterns on low value transactions that you're observing as a,
Sure.
as a company working on fraud prevention.
Sure, exactly as you said it, Michaela. Like we see that the segment of up to 30 euros is less safer, let's call it this way, from the higher buckets of up to 100 and even 250. And when you think about it, there are two use cases on this specific segment on the up to 30 euros, which is one, carding attacks, which is close to zero attempts to basically validate cards, stolen cards on the dark web. And that is a pattern that we're seeing. It's a specific use case with high velocity, and our, again, robust machine learning models can block those carding attacks. So that's the very, very low value of transactions. And up to 30 euros, again, we know and we see it from our data, the transaction data after fraudsters. So not only going to the dark web, but actually fraud patterns that we see on our transaction data, that again, 30 euros is less safer than the higher buckets. And therefore, exactly as you said it, we recommend utilizing the TRA, meaning transaction risk analysis, also on the up to 30 euros, and send it, there's an overlap basically between the low amount and the low risk exemption. We prefer and we recommend any merchant to send it through the low risk, meaning the TRA flow, and with that specific exemption flag, due to the reasons that we mentioned before, the mid and the fact that they need to secure their fraud rates even after and in a PSD2 future.
Great, Doron, thank you so much. And because the time actually is over, but I have my last question that is actually is not mine, but from the audience and is on you. So how many transactions do you expect to be managed and as exemption by your solution?
So I think we covered it a bit, but there isn't one size fits all, right? If it's a low ticket merchant, so probably maybe their entire volume can go through TRA because it depends on the thresholds. If it's a high ticket merchant, then we need to assess on a market level, again, total European volumes that we have explored, what is the eligibility for TRA. We anticipate that around 25% can go through the TRA as is. Again, on a merchant level, it's more detailed. So we really need to have a discussion and assess what are the potential for TRA, and there is potential.
Absolutely with you. I think that the time is really over, and I don't see any other questions, but I guess that we really cover all the topics. Before closing, I would like to thank you all to be here today, and of course all the panelists to join us in this event. Last two things. The first one, as we discussed during the presentation, we will send you the dedicated white paper on what we discuss. And of course, if you have any additional questions or whatever you want to discuss deep, we are available as Axerve, and of course the key account manager, both from Axerve and Riskified, are available to discuss deeper. So thank you again, and have a nice day.